Sometimes the quietest knock on a door is the one that changes every life inside. The town of Ashford, Montana still slept beneath a blanket of pale autumn fog as the old clock above the police station lobby quietly marked 4:52 in the morning. The streets outside were empty except for scattered leaves drifting across the pavement, pushed gently by a cool breeze carrying the scent of pine, damp earth, and distant wood smoke. Inside the station, the fluorescent lights hummed softly above rows of empty desks while a half-finished cup of black coffee rested beside an open incident report. Officer Caleb Mercer leaned back in his chair for a brief moment, rubbing tired eyes that had learned long ago how to stay alert through endless night shifts. At 37, Caleb carried himself with the calm discipline of a man who had once worn the uniform of a United States Marine before choosing a quieter life, protecting a small mountain town. His broad shoulders remained straight even after hours behind a desk, and the faded scars hidden beneath his uniform reminded him that not every battle was fought with weapons. Some were fought simply by showing up when someone needed help. Resting near the station entrance was Shadow, the department's 7-year-old German Shepherd. His powerful black and tan frame appeared relaxed, but his ears moved with every distant sound beyond the glass doors. Years of police work had sharpened instincts that no amount of training manuals could fully explain. Caleb often joked that Shadow noticed trouble long before the radio ever did. On most nights, the dog proved him right. Without warning, Shadow slowly lifted his head. His amber eyes locked onto the darkness outside the station. Every muscle in his body became perfectly still. Caleb glanced toward the entrance, expecting to see headlights or perhaps someone walking through the fog. There was nothing. Only silence waiting beneath the dim streetlights. "What is it, buddy?" Caleb asked quietly. Shadow did not answer with a bark. Instead, he rose to his feet and walked toward the automatic doors with measured confidence. The doors slid open, allowing a rush of crisp morning air to sweep across the lobby. The scent of wet leaves drifted inside. Before Caleb could reach him, Shadow disappeared into the mist beyond the parking lot. Caleb stepped outside, scanning the empty street lined with quiet storefronts and sleeping homes. The fog swallowed everything beyond 50 feet. He waited, listening. Somewhere in the distance an owl called once before falling silent again. 5 long minutes passed. Then a dark silhouette slowly emerged through the pale gray veil. Shadow was returning. His pace was careful, almost deliberate, each step placed with remarkable precision. As he came closer beneath the station lights, Caleb felt his heartbeat slow with disbelief. Wrapped inside a soft cream-colored baby blanket rested a tiny newborn infant. Shadow held one folded corner of the blanket gently between his teeth, keeping the baby level and secure with extraordinary care. The little girl's face remained peaceful beneath a knitted cap, her tiny fingers curled against the warm fabric as though she trusted the world completely. Caleb rushed forward and immediately knelt beside the German Shepherd. Shadow carefully lowered the blanket onto the clean tile floor without the slightest sign of panic or confusion. Caleb's hands moved with practiced calm as he checked the baby's breathing. Warm, steady, alive. Relief washed over him before 100 impossible questions rushed in behind it. "Emily," he called toward the dispatch room, his voice steady despite the shock. "Call an ambulance. Right now." Dispatcher Emily Foster hurried into the lobby, stopping so suddenly that the clipboard slipped from her hands. She stared at the sleeping infant, then at Shadow, unable to find words. The station seemed to hold its breath. But while everyone else looked at the baby, Shadow never did. His eyes remained fixed on the open doorway beyond the morning fog. He stepped outside once more, paused, and turned back toward Caleb. Then he looked into the darkness again. There was no fear in his expression, only quiet certainty. It was the unmistakable look of a partner trying to say one simple thing. "This is only the beginning." Caleb gently lifted the newborn into his arms, surprised by how impossibly light she felt beneath the thick blanket. The little girl stirred only once before settling peacefully against the warmth of his uniform jacket, her tiny breaths soft and steady. Emily Foster was already speaking into the emergency radio, her calm dispatcher voice carrying an urgency she rarely needed in a town as quiet as Ashford. Within seconds, the request for paramedics echoed across the county frequency, while Caleb carefully carried the infant to a padded bench beneath the brighter lights of the station lobby. Shadow remained near the entrance. He did not approach the baby again. Instead, he stood perfectly still, watching the darkness outside through the open doorway. Every few moments, he shifted his gaze toward Caleb before looking back into the fog, repeating the same silent pattern again and again. Caleb had worked beside the German shepherd long enough to recognize what others might have dismissed as simple restlessness. This was communication. During search and rescue training years earlier, Shadow had behaved exactly the same way whenever another missing person remained undiscovered. Caleb remembered his former K-9 instructor saying, "If a good police dog insists the job is not finished, believe him before you believe your own assumptions." Those words returned now with unexpected clarity. The distant sound of an approaching ambulance gradually broke the silence outside. Red and white emergency lights reflected softly across the station windows as Daniel Ross and Olivia Bennett hurried inside, carrying pediatric medical equipment. Their practiced movements were calm and reassuring. Daniel smiled gently after checking the baby's pulse, breathing, and body temperature. "She is cold, but she is stable," he said quietly. "She is stronger than she looks." Olivia wrapped another warm blanket around the infant before placing a tiny knitted cap over her head. "Someone made sure she had a chance," she whispered. Caleb looked down at the peaceful little face resting beneath the blankets. Whoever had entrusted this child to Shadow had done everything possible to keep her safe. That realization settled heavily inside him. This was not abandonment. It was an act of desperate hope. As Daniel prepared to transport the newborn to Ashford Community Hospital, Shadow suddenly released one short bark. Every person inside the station turned toward him. The German shepherd stepped through the automatic doors into the morning fog, stopped just beyond the sidewalk, and looked back directly at Caleb. His tail remained perfectly still. His ears stood high. Then he took several slow steps forward before stopping once again. It was impossible to misunderstand. Emily quietly lowered her radio. "He wants you to follow him." Caleb nodded without taking his eyes off his partner. "I know." Daniel secured the baby inside a portable infant carrier before looking toward Caleb. "We have her from here." Caleb hesitated only a moment before making his decision. He trusted the paramedics completely. He trusted Shadow even more. Reaching for his radio and flashlight, he stepped into the cold morning air where damp pine, scented the breeze, and pale sunlight had only begun touching the distant mountain peaks. Shadow waited until Caleb stood beside him. Only then did the German shepherd quietly turn toward the empty street leading away from town. He did not rush. He did not hesitate. Every measured step carried the calm certainty of someone who already knew exactly where hope was still waiting. Caleb took one last glance toward the ambulance pulling away with the newborn before following the faithful dog into the fading fog, sensing that somewhere beyond the quiet streets another life was depending on them. Shadow led without looking back. The streets of Ashford slowly disappeared behind them as the quiet town surrendered to open fields brushed with silver morning mist. Caleb matched the German shepherd's steady pace, his boots crunching softly across damp gravel while the eastern sky slowly brightened with streaks of pale gold. The cool mountain air carried the scent of pine, cedar, and fresh rain lingering from the night before. Somewhere beyond the hills, a meadowlark greeted the sunrise, its gentle song drifting across the empty countryside. Yet Shadow never acknowledged the beauty surrounding them. His attention remained fixed on the invisible path ahead. Caleb keyed his radio as they reached the edge of County Road 12. "Dispatch, this is Officer Mercer. I am following Shadow approximately 1 mile north of town. Request Deputy Ryan Collins remain available if I need assistance." Emily answered immediately. "Copy that, Caleb. You have clear radio contact. Please keep us updated." Caleb thanked her and clipped the radio back onto his vest. He trusted the equipment, but this morning he trusted his partner far more. The gravel road gradually narrowed into an old logging trail bordered by towering lodgepole pines, whose branches filtered the first rays of sunlight into long golden beams. Moisture clung to every blade of grass, soaking Caleb's boots as he followed the German shepherd deeper into the forest. Shadow slowed only once, lowering his nose toward the ground before continuing with quiet confidence. He was not searching. He was remembering. Caleb noticed something unusual several minutes later. A narrow strip of pale blue fabric fluttered gently from a low cedar branch beside the trail. It had been tied carefully rather than torn loose by the wind. He removed it with gentle hands, studying the faded cloth. It carried the faint scent of fresh laundry soap mixed with pine and cool morning air. He folded the fabric and slipped it into his jacket pocket before continuing after Shadow. 50 yards farther, another strip appeared. Then another. Each one was tied where it could easily be seen by someone willing to pay attention. Caleb felt a quiet realization begin to settle inside him. These were not accidents. Someone had been leaving a trail. Shadow crossed a shallow creek where clear water flowed gently around smooth gray stones before climbing the opposite bank without hesitation. Caleb followed, feeling the icy water seep briefly through the soles of his boots. The forest grew quieter with every step. Even the birds seemed to pause as though waiting for something hidden beyond the trees. At last the trail opened into a small clearing wrapped in drifting morning fog. Standing alone beneath towering pines was an old wooden cabin weathered by decades of Montana winters. Ivy climbed across one wall, and a rusted lantern still hung beside the front porch. The place appeared forgotten, yet something immediately told Caleb otherwise. A thin curl of steam drifted from a ceramic mug resting on the porch railing. Someone had prepared coffee not long ago. Shadow stopped 20 feet from the cabin and remained perfectly still. His ears lifted. His eyes turned away from the front door and focused instead on the narrow path disappearing behind the cabin into the deeper woods. He released one soft whine before looking back at Caleb. It was not a warning. It was an invitation. Caleb slowly reached for the flashlight on his belt, though daylight now filled the clearing. His heartbeat remained calm, steady, and certain. Whatever waited beyond that cabin had trusted a faithful dog with a newborn child. Now it was waiting for the only person willing to trust the dog in return. Caleb approached the weathered cabin with measured steps, every instinct sharpened by years of military service and police work. The old wooden porch creaked softly beneath the morning breeze, while sunlight filtered through tall pines and painted narrow bands of gold across faded planks. The ceramic mug still released a faint ribbon of steam, carrying the rich aroma of black coffee into the cool mountain air. Someone had been here only a short time earlier. Caleb rested one hand near his radio before knocking firmly on the cabin door. Ashford Police Department, he called with a calm voice. If anyone is inside, I am here to help. Only silence answered him. He waited several seconds before knocking again. The forest remained still except for the distant murmur of the creek and the gentle whisper of wind moving through cedar branches. Slowly he turned the worn brass handle. The unlocked door drifted inward with a quiet creak. Coming in, Caleb announced before stepping across the threshold. The cabin was simple but carefully kept. A cast-iron stove stood near one wall beside neatly stacked firewood. A folded quilt rested across a small sofa. Children's storybooks sat in a tidy row on an old bookshelf, while a rocking chair faced a stone fireplace where the last embers had already cooled. Nothing suggested abandonment. Instead, everything reflected the quiet life of someone preparing for a new beginning. On the kitchen table rested an open notebook beside a half-finished knitting project made from pale blue yarn. A tiny pair of knitted baby booties lay carefully folded nearby. Caleb's eyes paused on a framed photograph standing beside the window. A smiling young woman with light brown hair stood in front of the same cabin, one hand resting gently on her pregnant belly while autumn leaves surrounded her beneath a bright Montana sky. Written across the bottom of the picture in careful handwriting were the words, "Every sunrise begins with hope." Caleb quietly returned the photograph exactly where he found it. Outside, Shadow released a soft whine. Caleb immediately stepped back onto the porch. The German shepherd had moved beyond the cabin and now stood beside a narrow footpath leading deeper into the woods. His posture remained calm but purposeful. He lowered his nose briefly toward the ground before looking directly at Caleb once again. Without hesitation, Caleb followed. The path wound gently downhill through towering pines where shafts of sunlight pierced the thinning fog. Several more strips of pale blue fabric appeared tied neatly to low branches, each one placed just far enough apart to guide someone willing to notice them. They were not random. They formed a deliberate trail stretching farther into the forest. After several minutes, the path opened into a quiet clearing where enormous cedar roots rose from the earth like natural shelter. Shadow stopped beside them and slowly lowered himself onto the moss-covered ground. He did not bark. He simply looked beneath the tangled roots with patient expectation. Caleb knelt carefully and peered into the shaded space. Resting against a weathered backpack was a young woman wrapped in a light blanket, her breathing slow but steady. One hand still rested protectively across an empty space where a baby had clearly been held only hours before. Nearby sat an empty water bottle, a flashlight with fading batteries, several clean diapers, and a small canvas bag packed with baby supplies. Everything told the same quiet story. She had prepared for her child with love, even while facing impossible circumstances. Caleb gently spoke her name after noticing a driver's license partially visible inside an open wallet. "Hannah, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered. Before she fully opened them, her fingers reached instinctively toward Shadow. The faithful German shepherd stepped closer and rested his head beneath her hand. A faint smile appeared across her tired face as she whispered barely above the sound of the wind. "Did she make it?" Caleb smiled with quiet reassurance. "Your little girl is safe." Shadow brought her exactly where she needed to be. A single tear slipped gently down Hannah's cheek, not from fear, but from the overwhelming relief of knowing that hope had followed the path she trusted enough to leave behind. Caleb immediately pressed the emergency button on his radio while never taking his eyes off Hannah. "Dispatch, this is Officer Mercer. I have located an adult female approximately 1.5 miles north of County Road 12. She is conscious but exhausted. Request medical assistance at my location immediately." Emily answered without hesitation. "Copy that, Caleb. Ambulance and Deputy Ryan Collins are already on the way. Estimated arrival 7 minutes." Caleb removed his field jacket and gently placed it across Hannah's shoulders. The crisp morning air still carried a chill beneath the shade of the towering pines, but sunlight had begun reaching the clearing, warming patches of moss with soft golden light. Shadow quietly lay beside Hannah, never leaving her side. The moment his muzzle rested against her arm, she slowly opened her eyes again. Her breathing became steadier as recognition settled across her face. She looked first at the faithful German shepherd before lifting tired eyes toward Caleb. "My baby," she whispered, her voice barely stronger than the breeze moving through the cedar branches. Caleb smiled reassuringly. "She is safe. The paramedics are taking wonderful care of her at the hospital." Hannah closed her eyes for a brief moment as tears quietly rolled across her cheeks. They were not tears of fear. They were tears of relief, so deep that words could no longer carry them. She reached weakly toward Shadow and gently stroked the fur beneath his ears. "Good boy," she whispered. "You found them." Shadow answered only by closing his eyes for a moment beneath her hand. Minutes later, the distant sound of approaching vehicles echoed through the forest. Deputy Ryan Collins appeared first, followed closely by Daniel Ross and Olivia Bennett carrying emergency medical equipment along the narrow trail. They immediately knelt beside Hannah with calm professionalism. Daniel carefully checked her pulse while Olivia wrapped a thermal blanket around her shoulders and offered small sips of water. "You are going to be all right," Olivia said with a reassuring smile. Hannah nodded faintly before looking toward Caleb. "I knew he would understand." Caleb glanced at Shadow before quietly asking the question that had remained in his heart since the moment the German shepherd entered the station carrying the newborn. "How did you know to trust him?" Hannah looked toward the canopy above where sunlight shimmered between the branches. "A few weeks ago, he wandered near the cabin while your department was training nearby. I left fresh water outside. Every afternoon, he would stop for a few minutes before returning to work. He never acted like a stranger." She paused to gather another slow breath. "When my daughter arrived much earlier than I expected, I realized I could not safely carry her all the way back to town. Then Shadow appeared outside the cabin. I wrapped her carefully, tied my blue scarf beneath his collar, pointed toward the road, and asked him to find help." Her tired smile returned. "It sounds impossible when I say it aloud." Caleb slowly shook his head. "Not today, it does not." Daniel looked toward the faded blue scarf still secured beneath Shadow's collar and quietly smiled. "Sometimes experience teaches us to trust evidence," he said. "Sometimes life teaches us to trust something even deeper." As the rescue team carefully prepared Hannah for the journey back to town, Caleb looked once more at the faithful German shepherd resting peacefully beside her. No command had told Shadow to carry a newborn through the darkness. No training manual had explained what to do when a frightened mother placed all her hope into his care. Somewhere between instinct and compassion, the remarkable dog had made a choice that no one in Ashford would ever forget. And as the first full light of morning spread across the quiet forest, Caleb realized he had not simply followed a trail through the woods. He had followed the path of a mother's faith carried by the heart of a loyal friend. By late afternoon, the rescue vehicles rolled quietly into Ashford Community Hospital beneath a clear Montana sky, washed clean by the autumn sun. Warm lights spilled across the brick walls while maple leaves drifted gently through the parking lot, their colors glowing like small reminders that every season carried both endings and beginnings. Caleb walked beside the stretcher until the medical staff guided Hannah safely through the emergency entrance. Shadow remained close behind, his steady footsteps never once breaking rhythm. No one asked the faithful German shepherd to wait outside. Somehow, every nurse and doctor who heard the story understood that he had already earned his place. Inside the maternity wing, the newborn rested peacefully beneath a heated blanket, her tiny chest rising and falling with quiet determination. Daniel Ross smiled as he checked the monitor one final time before looking toward Caleb. "She is doing very well," he said. "She is healthy, strong, and already proving she has a remarkable story to tell one day." Olivia Bennett gently wheeled the bassinet into Hannah's room. The young mother slowly reached forward with trembling hands, and the moment her daughter was placed safely into her arms, the room became perfectly still. Hannah closed her eyes, pressing her cheek lightly against the baby's soft knitted cap, while silent tears of gratitude slipped down her face. "Welcome home, Grace," she whispered. "You never stopped finding your way back to me." Caleb quietly stepped toward the doorway, believing the family deserved a private moment, but Hannah looked up with a gentle smile. "Please stay," she said softly. "You and Shadow are part of this story now." Shadow slowly approached the bedside and rested his head against the mattress. Grace stirred gently before opening her tiny eyes for only a brief moment. One impossibly small hand reached through the blanket and settled against the thick fur on Shadow's muzzle. The old police dog remained perfectly still, his amber eyes calm and patient, as though protecting the smallest promise he had ever carried. Hannah smiled through fresh tears. "I never truly sent my daughter away," she said. "I simply trusted the right heart to carry her where love was waiting." Caleb lowered his eyes for a moment, feeling the quiet weight of those words. Years in uniform had taught him about courage, sacrifice, and responsibility, yet nothing had prepared him for witnessing faith placed so completely into another living soul. Before leaving the room, he untied the faded blue scarf from beneath Shadow's collar and carefully folded it into Hannah's hands. "This belongs with Grace," he said. Hannah wrapped the scarf gently around the baby's blanket before looking toward Shadow once more. "One day she will ask how she survived her first morning," she whispered. "I will tell her that hope arrived wearing 4 paws." Caleb smiled quietly as evening sunlight painted the hospital room in soft shades of gold. Outside the window, the mountains stood peacefully against the fading sky, unchanged by everything that had happened beneath them. Yet inside that small room, 4 lives had become forever connected by one impossible dawn, one faithful German shepherd, and one simple decision to trust compassion when there was nothing else left to hold on to. Some people spend years searching for proof that miracles still exist. Sometimes they begin with nothing more than a loyal friend who refuses to walk away. The story quietly found its way beyond the walls of Ashford Community Hospital without anyone intending it to. No television crews gathered outside the entrance. No reporters crowded the hallways. It began instead with a single nurse telling her husband about the remarkable police dog who had arrived carrying a newborn through the morning fog. By the end of the week, nearly everyone in town had heard some version of the story, yet each person repeated the same detail with quiet amazement. The dog never thought about himself. He only kept searching until every life was safe. Caleb returned to his regular patrol schedule, but ordinary mornings no longer felt quite the same. Every time Shadow climbed into the patrol vehicle beside him, Caleb found himself glancing at the faithful German shepherd with a deeper sense of gratitude than he had ever expressed aloud. Their partnership had always been built on trust. Now it had become something even stronger. It had become shared history that neither of them would ever forget. Several days after Hannah and Grace returned home, Caleb drove the patrol truck along the familiar mountain road leading back toward the old cabin. Shadow sat quietly beside him, watching the passing pines through the open window as cool autumn air carried the scent of cedar and fresh rain into the cab. They found Hannah standing on the front porch beneath a sky painted bright blue after the previous night's storm. She smiled warmly the moment she saw them. Grace rested peacefully inside a small carrier wrapped in the same cream-colored blanket, now clean and carefully folded around her tiny shoulders. Hannah invited Caleb inside for coffee, and for the first time the cabin no longer felt like a place marked by uncertainty. Fresh flowers rested in a mason jar on the kitchen table. Sunlight streamed through polished windows. The little knitted booties Caleb had noticed days earlier now rested beside the baby's cradle. The house had become exactly what Hannah had always hoped it would be. Before Caleb left, Hannah handed him a small wooden box carved by her late grandfather many years earlier. Inside rested a simple silver dog tag engraved with only 3 words: "Faith finds home." Caleb looked at the engraving for a long moment before fastening the tag beside Shadow's official police identification collar. The German shepherd lowered his head slightly, as though accepting the gift with quiet dignity. Autumn slowly gave way to winter. Snow covered the rooftops of Ashford, softened the forest trails, and wrapped the mountains in brilliant white. Through every season, Shadow continued serving beside Caleb with the same steady devotion that had defined his entire career. Yet whenever patrol routes brought them near Hannah's cabin, Shadow always slowed for a moment, his tail wagging gently as Grace laughed from the porch whenever she spotted him through the window. The visits became an unspoken tradition. Coffee waited for Caleb. Fresh water always waited for Shadow. Years passed almost unnoticed until one spring afternoon the police department announced Shadow's retirement after a long and distinguished career. Officers from neighboring counties gathered quietly outside the station while families lined the sidewalks beneath blooming trees. Hannah arrived holding Grace's hand. The little girl, now old enough to understand the stories she had heard since childhood, walked directly toward Shadow carrying a carefully wrapped package. She knelt in front of him and unfolded a hand-painted picture showing a German shepherd walking through morning fog with a tiny baby wrapped safely in a blanket beneath a sky filled with golden light. Across the bottom she had written in careful letters, "Thank you for bringing me home." Caleb felt emotion quietly tighten inside his chest as Shadow gently touched the edge of the painting with his nose before looking at Grace with the same calm eyes that had watched over her on the first morning of her life. In that peaceful moment, no speeches were necessary. Some stories are remembered because they are extraordinary. Others endure because they quietly remind ordinary people that kindness, faith, and loyalty still exist. Long after badges are placed in display cases and paw prints disappear from dusty trails, the lives touched by those simple choices continue walking forward, carrying hope into places where words alone could never reach. Spring settled gently over Ashford once again, and with it came the quiet comfort of familiar routines. The mountains stood beneath clear blue skies, wildflowers returned to the meadows surrounding the old cabin, and every sunrise carried the same golden light that Caleb would forever associate with the morning everything changed. Shadow no longer climbed into a patrol vehicle before dawn, yet he still woke early each day as though years of service had become part of his heartbeat. Retirement had not changed who he was. It had simply given him more time to spend with the people whose lives had become forever connected to his own. Almost every Saturday afternoon Caleb drove to Hannah's cabin, where fresh coffee waited on the porch, and Grace came running across the yard with laughter bright enough to fill the entire valley. Shadow always met her halfway, his tail moving with quiet happiness while the little girl wrapped both arms around his neck before proudly leading him toward the large oak tree overlooking the meadow. It had become their favorite place. Grace often sat beside the aging German shepherd reading children's books aloud while Shadow rested his head across her lap, listening with the same patient attention he had once given every command during his years in uniform. Hannah would watch from the porch with peaceful eyes, knowing that her daughter had grown up believing courage looked less like fearlessness and more like faithful kindness. One warm afternoon, Grace disappeared into the cabin and returned carrying the faded blue scarf that had once guided Caleb through the forest. Although time had softened its color, every carefully stitched thread remained intact. Hannah smiled as she watched Grace gently tie the scarf around Shadow's collar for a few quiet moments before removing it again and folding it with great care. "I just wanted him to wear it one more time," Grace said softly. Caleb looked toward the distant tree line where the hidden trail had once led him through uncertainty toward hope. "Some things never stop meaning something," he replied. Later that evening, the four of them walked together through the meadow as the setting sun painted the mountains with shades of amber and rose. A cool breeze carried the scent of pine, fresh grass, and wild lavender across the hills while birds drifted quietly toward their nests. Shadow walked at an easy pace between Caleb and Grace, no longer the powerful young police dog who could cover miles without slowing, but still carrying the quiet dignity that had always defined him. Every few steps, Grace reached down to rest her small hand against his shoulder, as though reminding herself he was truly there beside her. Caleb watched the scene in thoughtful silence. Years earlier, he had believed his greatest responsibility was protecting strangers from danger. Shadow had quietly taught him something deeper. Sometimes the greatest gift was simply refusing to leave someone alone when hope seemed impossible to find. As twilight settled across the valley, the cabin windows began glowing warmly against the fading sky, welcoming everyone home once again. No medals hung in that peaceful room. No newspaper articles covered the walls. Only family photographs rested upon the mantel, each one capturing ordinary moments filled with extraordinary love. In nearly every picture, Shadow appeared somewhere nearby, never standing at the center, never seeking attention, simply watching over the people who had become his family. Perhaps that was the truest measure of a faithful heart. It does not ask to be remembered. It simply continues choosing love, one quiet day after another, until those small acts become the story future generations will never forget. Years continued to pass with the quiet certainty of changing seasons. The mountains surrounding Ashford remained faithful to every sunrise. The creek still whispered through smooth stones beneath the old cedar trees, and the narrow trail marked long ago by faded strips of blue fabric slowly became part of the forest once more. Nature had reclaimed nearly every visible trace of that extraordinary morning, yet the lives touched by it carried the memory as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. Grace grew into a kind and thoughtful young woman whose heart seemed naturally drawn toward helping others. Whenever classmates asked why she volunteered at the local animal shelter every weekend, or why she always paused to greet every service dog she met, Hannah would simply smile. Some stories, she believed, were best understood through the life they inspired rather than the words used to explain them. Shadow had grown noticeably older. The black fur around his face had gradually turned silver, and his once powerful stride had become slower, more careful, yet his gentle amber eyes never lost the quiet wisdom that had always guided him. Caleb visited almost every evening after work, sitting beside the old German shepherd on the porch while the sun settled behind the Montana hills. They rarely needed words. The peaceful silence between them had been earned through years of shared trust. One golden autumn afternoon, Grace invited Caleb and Hannah to the small elementary school where she had volunteered to read stories to younger children. When the reading ended, one little boy raised his hand and asked, "Do heroes always wear uniforms?" Grace looked toward Shadow, who rested peacefully near the front of the room as children gently stroked his weathered coat. She smiled before answering softly, "Sometimes they wear fur instead." The classroom became wonderfully quiet. Even the children seemed to understand that some truths did not need to be spoken loudly. Before leaving, Grace carefully placed the old blue scarf inside a simple wooden shadow box beside Shadow's silver tag engraved with the words, "Faith finds home." Beneath them rested the crayon drawing she had given him years earlier. The display would remain at the school library, so every child could remember that courage often begins with kindness. Later that evening, the four of them returned to the old cabin one final time before winter. They stood together beneath the great oak tree overlooking the meadow where warm light stretched across the grass like liquid gold. Caleb rested one hand gently on Shadow's shoulder while Hannah held Grace close beside her. No one hurried to leave. The wind carried the familiar scent of pine, cedar, and fresh earth, just as it had on the morning when Hope first walked quietly through the forest. Caleb looked toward the distant trail disappearing beneath the trees and realized that the greatest moments of his life had never arrived with sirens, applause, or celebration. They had arrived disguised as ordinary choices made by faithful hearts. Shadow slowly lifted his head, breathing deeply as the evening breeze brushed through his silvered fur. Grace knelt beside him and whispered, "Thank you for finding all of us." The old German shepherd gently rested his head against her shoulder, and for a long, peaceful moment the world seemed to stand perfectly still. Some people spend their lives searching for miracles that change the world overnight. Yet the most lasting miracles often begin with one quiet act of compassion, one impossible decision to trust, and one loyal soul who refuses to walk away when another life depends upon hope. Long after footsteps fade and voices become memories, love continues the journey they began, carrying its light from one generation to the next with gentle faith that never asks for recognition, only the chance to lead someone safely home.